Hi, I'm Steve Carlson. Welcome to my U.S. Senate campaign website. I'm the U.S. Senate nominee for the Independence Party of Minnesota. Here on my website, you can scroll down. The key is scroll down, because I've got a lot of issues here. I have committed myself to, nay, expounded on the entire range of issues that concern the American people in this election. Fearlessly, because these issues are real, and we need to educate ourselves about them, and we need action. I don't mean big government solutions. I have real solutions. How to secure the border and really reform immigration. How to get rid of Obamacare and really reform health care. How to fix the achievement gap and exclusion in Minnesota. How to relieve the Minnesota households of consumer debt and create millions of jobs in this nation, of which Minnesota will be a leader. How to reverse the direction of the federal debt and empower the 50 states. How to defend ourselves in the world and to lead. How to stay true to our religious liberties, which I am a person of faith. But the subject here is far from the ken of an Al Franken, Harvard or not, and a Mike McFadden or an NPR. But you can watch it and tell me on Twitter what you think. And go out and vote, and go out and lead, and save our nation. Yes, I am the Tea Party. You are the Tea Party. You have this calling, as do I. And unlike what the Rochester Post Bulletin editorial board said, they're nice, well-meaning people, interesting people, and I thank them for the invitation to talk about my positions on a range of issues. But I am not just an idea man, and I thank them for their kind words on that. But when I say I have solutions, I mean I have leadership solutions. And you can find those issue solutions by scrolling down. Scrolling down. In this video, I will discuss my motion to the United States Supreme Court, Justice Stephen Breyer, to allow me into a debate that is being held today with a left-wing media outfit called NPR, here in St. Paul. I will explain very clearly how the U.S. Constitution requires our Minnesota Supreme Court to enforce the First Amendment when complaints of rigged debates are brought to them under the equal protection, under the the First Amendment, and also under the equal time requirements. And for that matter, the First Amendment is the leading protector of our democracy. And I am talking about fighting through litigation for our democracy, through advocacy and political leadership for a true democracy here in Minnesota and for free and fair elections, which your Minnesota legal establishment disdains. And that's a big problem, and we need to address this as a people. If you believe that we need to address this as a people to have a free and fair election enforced by the rule of law and not by the Minnesota legal establishment, then please hear what I have to say, because this is an authentic exposition of the United States Constitution by a Tea Party leader. I beat Kevin Terrell. And the IP establishment, yes, there is even a small IP establishment. Tom Horner was a Republican trader all along, and he's jumped ship and promised the media he's left the IP lifeless for good. But the IP establishment, as I was saying, got real upset about my winning and helped these mindless leftist liberals to tell a lot of lies about my positions. And if you look at my real positions, you'll see I'm about common sense, I'm about solutions, I'm about making America and Minnesota work, and I'm about compassion for all the people. I'm a leader on this. Perhaps I am an ideal leader, but I'm ready to heal the Senate, the United States Senate, heal our democracy. I have a song called Heal Thy Nation. That is what this nation needs, is healing. That requires leadership, and that's what I would provide in any debate with Al Franken and Mike McFadden. But our basically fascist political system in Minnesota quashes debate, won't tolerate dissent or ideas. Today, on Minnesota Public Radio, you will be able to hear a so-called staged debate between liberal media outlet NPR and their journalistic activists showing love to their hero, Al Franken, looking in their narcissistic mirror, liking themselves like Stuart Little. A few years ago, by some miracle, Jesse Ventura got past these little fawning gatekeepers and had this to say: I was allowed to debate. I proved that you could go from 10% to 37% and win if you're allowed to debate. Rest assured, these two parties don't want to ever see that happen again," unquote. Truer words were never spoken. Governor Ventura was explaining his astounding victory. 6 weeks before the 1998 gubernatorial election in Minnesota, the Star Tribune pegged Reform Party candidate Jesse Ventura at 10% in the polls. 3 debates later, on October 20th, he was at 21%. Remarkably, Ventura's cash-strapped campaign had not yet aired a single television advertisement. On Election Day, Ventura captured 37% of the vote and became the governor of Minnesota. And during his tenure, the name of the Reform Party was changed to Independence Party, and I'm here with you today as their nominee for U.S. Senate. For the past 6 weeks, however, I, as the nominee, have been forced to respond to little hints in the media that slick New Yorker Al Franken and his millions of dollars had conned the local media into setting up just 3 debates with millionaire Mike McFadden, Mr. Energy, and to exclude the Independence Party, me, for the entire debate season. I could have stood by and accepted this little fascist tactic, a tactic fit for Josef Stalin or Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Or I could document this case and seek a remedy. You need that remedy. This isn't about me. It's about the Minnesota DFL rigging elections in Minnesota to overrepresent homosexuals, women, and racial minorities, and to really topple Minnesota as they did in 2012. And they're still cheering on the destruction of Minnesota values and squandering our future. And they're getting behind the celebrity and wealth of this New York comedian to steamroll the state. They are in the driver's seat in this state, even though they're getting creamed around the country. They could lose the legislative races to the Republicans, and I urge you to vote the DFL out of the state legislature on November 4th. And the DFL has done this, have betrayed Minnesota by getting corrupt state judges. Here's where the legal case comes, to allow them to violate at will our U.S. Constitution. The exclusion worked out by these rich media interests who have taken in perhaps $100 million this year, these TV and radio broadcasters, to line their pockets while the people of Minnesota suffer, and homosexuals are forced into their private property, and they are told to celebrate and dance even. Maybe they shoot at their feet with pistols to make them dance on these small farms where the party comes to town with the so-called Minnesota Department of Human Rights. But these FCC licensees believe that they have exploited the tragic death of Paul Wellstone to destroy democracy in Minnesota, that it's gone and they are no longer accountable. Lawyers and judges may continue to look down their noses at this, but I am going to show you today that they are looking down their noses at the United States Constitution. FCC licensees who sponsored these so-called candidate debates for the U.S. Senate, featuring only the DFL party, part of Barack Obama's party, and the GOP, part of the Republican establishment party, they did that because they have ensured that candidates' debates, even on FCC licensees like WCCO, CBS, Minnesota Public Radio, and My9 TV in Duluth, will never put their candidates at risk of losing a U.S. Senate seat. And in my case, Franken and McFadden, 2 peas in the pod, only one's funnier, have negotiated with Minnesota mainstream media a season-long general election policy of excluding the Independence Party from their so-called candidate debates for the U.S. Senate candidate debates, but without the candidates. This fiasco grew out of the events surrounding the tragic death of Senator Paul Wellstone, who I worked with on several occasions decades ago. But let's go back to 1998. But we've already covered that. So we'll go on to 2002, and with the tragedy of Wellstone, that a Minnesota court began this exclusion of the Independence Party, not even considering that the Independence Party was at that time a major party and what the legal and constitutional implications are of that. And now I'm reading from my motion for injunction to the U.S. Supreme Court that is still pending, and I am asking them to lift the unconstitutional burden of the First Amendment rights of the free association and free expression of Minnesota independent voters, which this Minnesota Supreme Court has imposed on the Minnesota Independence Party. They have imposed a burden on our First Amendment rights, and it's hitting me as the Independence Party nominee. CBS Broadcasting, owner of WCCO, appearing in the Minnesota Supreme Court against the Independence Party, brought to light that the problem of excluding Independence Party nominees from publicly broadcast debates actually began in 2002, when another Independence Party for U.S. Senate, James Moore, got caught up in tragic circumstances involving the death on October 25, 2002, of the late Senator Paul Wellstone. That tragedy produced a, quote, new election landscape, unquote. NPR, the same broadcaster of the debate today, was the defendant in this case in 2002. And John Borger, now representing CBS and them, represented NPR and got this judgment. The judge, Honorable Michael M. Monahan, found the fact that access to media is in the legally unfettered hands of private bodies has sobering implications for the vitality of a democratic system, unquote. Nevertheless, Monahan found that, quote, given the current state of the law as opposed to notions of fundamental fairness and organizational consistency of NPR, since he had invited Moore to the debate before they rejected him, and so he denied the motion, and he allowed the debate to go on without the Independence Party candidate, but this was because of the exigent circumstances of this tragedy of Paul Wellstone. And this is a different but related motion in the form of a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction to include the 2014 Independence Party nominee for U.S. Senate in the 2014 U.S. Senate candidate debate season by enjoining my participation tonight. The motion for injunction to enter the WCCO debate was denied by the court below, Minnesota Supreme Court, as moot after the case was thrown out on wrongful dismissal grounds, total irresponsibility and incompetence by Judge Gildale. And they have therefore failed in their duties under the United States Constitution to enforce the prescription of the Minnesota legislature. That is to say, to exercise jurisdiction and enforce the law and Constitution to make sure the election of U.S. Senator is conducted fairly and with due regard to my rights, to the IP's rights, under equal time and First Amendment, and to your rights as voters. Now, the sobering implications noted by Judge Monahan were not lost on NPR or the broadcast in other media or the campaigns here of Senator Al Franken and Mike McFadden. They have seized on this opportunity, relying on this decision by Judge Monahan, a state court district judge from Ramsey County, and now they have expanded impermissibly a whole new election landscape for Minnesota, which is unrestrained by notions of accountability to the First Amendment, due process, the duty of the state to enforce its election laws and electing members of the U.S. Senate, or the equal time requirements of the FCC. Now, the due process implications of this unconstitutional election process are that the laws will be made that substantively and procedurally bind you and I, and they're enforced without the constitutional basis of democratic representation in a Republican form of government. This violates my due process rights to have my laws passed by my duly elected representatives. And this violation of my rights also extends to the rights of all Americans. As a result of this expansion of NPR's new landscape, announced in more modest form in the 2002 case, in the 2014 campaign, what is being challenged is the total exclusion of the Independence Party, U.S. Senate nominee, movement Steve Carlson, elected in a statewide primary for the entire 2014 general election season. This includes the Duluth debate October 1st, the WCCO CBS TV debate October 26th, and the upcoming NPR debate today. And the petition and motion in the Minnesota court shows how this was consciously and blatantly planned and negotiated by these Democrat and Republican campaigns in 12 different sites involving multiple potential broadcast licensees. This is unprecedented. It is a free-for-all. Senator Franken, as an FCC communications specialist and media professional, has managed an entirely new concept which will expand the tragic six-day election landscape of 2002 to the entire nation and seriously undermine the entire democratic system. There will be no debates anywhere that are bound by the principles of the First Amendment and the equal time provisions, which the FCC did announce to me is dead. It is Movement's position that the Moore decision, this is the 2002 decision with James Moore, was not warranted by the law at that time or at this time, since the state, here the state of Minnesota, has the power and the duty to regulate its elections according to its laws and the U.S. Constitution, with some regulation by Congress, and certainly should not be applied to justify this program of exclusion by the two parties in the use of 3 different broadcast facilities. In other words, Moore decision cannot be expanded to this situation, but it is being. Further, NPR and the media generally have directly engaged in viewpoint discrimination against me because I am a Tea Party candidate for the U.S. Senate, because of some views NPR specifically, talking about Mike Mulcahy, news director, and Tom Scheck, reporter, have very falsely and injuriously attributed to me for their own ends. The issue is not whether the First Amendment protects their malicious comments, but whether they can claim an editorial right to exclude me from their broadcast debate that when they are engaging in impermissible viewpoint discrimination, as well as trespassing on my First Amendment rights of political expression and political association. And I'm going to show you a case that brings this to life. It's called Ex parte Yarborough. It's about using violence and intimidation against black voters in Georgia, and their argument, like Minnesota's argument, to the Supreme Court that this was just okay, that it was none of the Congress's business and none of the business of the U.S. Supreme Court. But it is. And I will win this case at the United States Supreme Court to protect our rights in a democracy, which these media hustlers and race hustlers like NPR and Al Franken and WCCO are trying to impose on us. And my argument is grounded in the U.S. Constitution, and that Constitution's assignment of duties of sitting Minnesota Supreme Court judges to enforce elections of the U.S. Senate through their omnibus election jurisdiction, so that these broadcasts and the Democrats and Republicans will at last comply with the U.S. Constitution. This duty of the Minnesota Supreme Court grows out of Section 4 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which declares that, quote, the elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, unquote. And as I say, I don't doubt that these elected judges and most lawyers are simply ignorant of this duty, and they need the guidance of the U.S. Supreme Court. And now is the time. The future of the independent voters and the Minnesota Independence Party is at stake. The time for change is now. I'm Steve Carlson, and I approve this message. I'll continue on a second video to be called Minnesota's Constitutional Duty to Hold Free and Fair Elections. It starts with the case Ex parte Yarborough about black voters who were physically intimidated so they would not try to vote in federal elections. And now I'll stop the recording. Having problems with this new computer.